Hi, I'm Canon from YGender, and I'm here today to talk to Sally Goldner from Transgender Victoria about some exciting developments in laws protecting gender identity in Australia.
Good to be with you.
Everything's been moving really fast. It seems a little hard to keep up with it all right now.
Well, it is a bit. We've got these 4 recent developments being amendments to the Federal Sex Discrimination Act to add gender identity, intersex status and sexual orientation as protected attributes. The Sex and Gender Guidelines released to cover the Commonwealth area, and in recent days the changes to Medicare to make them gender neutral, and at a state level a guideline for employers and employment for trans people. So the big one, in a way I suppose, which has been worked on for almost 17 years and has now got through Parliament, is the amendments to the Federal Act, which add these 3 new attributes. And I've got to add on behalf of our intersex cousins, as I call them, that the intersex attribute is virtually a world first here in Australia. Adding these attributes does 2 things overall, and they cover the federal jurisdiction for the first time. And the second thing that they do is they fill, let's say, cracks or gaps in existing state and territory law. And that latter one is particularly important for young people who are, I think it's fair to say, increasingly there's more genderqueer people, and the Victorian law didn't quite cover that. Now, because having this gap being filled, it will mean genderqueer people of any age, of course, are covered. So what the other thing that the federal law does is that it covers the whole federal jurisdiction in employment, provision of goods and services, and provision of education. So that's therefore helpful, say, for a young genderqueer person at university. That would also give extra coverage as well. So this law is very comprehensive in the areas of life it covers, the people it covers, and the fact that it goes through to gaps in the states and territory law. And in the long term, we'd be aiming to change state and territory laws so that it just matched up and everything was really clear.
Which is really important because a lot of state and territories don't have any protections, or really quite little protection in their state law.
Yeah, for trans people it varies, because say Victoria and Queensland might cover, we'll say, a spectrum of people from people who don't make a permanent transition or even haven't done anything at all, through to someone who has completed surgery but perhaps wouldn't cover genderqueer. So that would be Victoria and Queensland, whereas Western Australia probably only covers people who have had some sort of hormonal and or surgical treatment. So this fills a lot of gaps, and it also does it for other people in terms of sexual orientation. New South Wales, for example, didn't protect bisexual people prior to this. Now they will be covered as well. Well, this is the thing, we've got the 3 developments. Whilst in one sense they're separate with 1 law and 2 policy changes, there is a bit of crossover, because let's say the Sex and Gender Guidelines weren't introduced and the Federal Equal Opportunity Law comes in. People are going to go, well, hang on, there's still this discrimination. So there is a good, overall some pretty good holistic communication going on here that brings it all together, and everything backs up, and there are similar definitions in each thing as well. So it will make life a lot easier with having all these things going on. So it's really good.
So the Medicare reform, when did that come in?
That's kicked in about late July. And so what it does is gets rid of defining people in terms of a sex or gender identity, in terms of the needs for a surgical or just health process. And to give an example that went around some years ago, there was a trans man who had, let's say, changed the birth certificate to M quite legally, and then discovered something like a cyst on a remaining, in inverted commas, female part. And Medicare said, oh no, that's a female only operation. To give it to a male would be Medicare fraud, you can't get a rebate, which is obviously an appalling situation, because that person, regardless of sex or gender, needs the health treatment. By having this in place, it's really preventative, and so people will feel more comfortable accessing health treatment. They won't have to go through a whole disclosure of history in terms of their gender identity, or at least a heck of a lot less. So that's far less intrusive process and gives people better health outcomes.
So with that reform in terms of what might be an everyday thing, does that change the process of changing the gender marker at Medicare?
Doesn't quite do that, but I believe there's been some flexibility on the marker for some time with Medicare, but I would think that the federal equal opportunity laws, once they kick in, will certainly allow for someone to change their marker, and certainly the mailing title as well.
So just to go back a little bit, when does the federal law come into effect?
We don't have a date as yet, probably with all the political fun and games going on in Canberra, these things have been perhaps put down the priority list a bit, but it will certainly get introduced. I'd say sometime in August will be where that federal equal opportunity law kicks in, so perhaps if people can keep an eye on Facebook and website for Transgender Victoria.
Maybe just another thing we could talk about is the guidelines that have been developed with TGV and have just been released also.
Yeah, it's been a really busy time. This one's at the state level, where Transgender Victoria, in conjunction with the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, along with input from other great organisations like Zoe Bell Gender Centre, have come up, and with employer organisations, and this is really important, have come up with guidelines for employers and employment for trans people. Now, this is a Victorian one, so this makes it really clear for employers, not just in terms of the law, but the practical side of how to treat people, pronoun usage, the things that really hit trans people, again of all ages a lot, but probably hit younger trans and gender diverse people more. And also there's a lot of crossover, although it's about the employment area of life. It would cover things like provision of goods and services and other areas. There's a lot of material that's very, very similar. And I can give the hint that there could be a couple more sets of guidelines from the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission on trans to come in other areas, but just can't quite say more yet. So there's a lot happening, and I'd really plead with trans people. Sometimes it can seem bleak. A lot of people are listening. A lot of people want to help us. Hang in there, make some connections, because we're going in the right direction in Victoria and Australia.
Well, thanks very much for that, Sally. We might wind it up.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, and look forward to coming back and reporting about more exciting developments.